Watson, who has just been amazing and brilliant, and I want her to have her own TV show because she's so funny. And I feel like Terry is a new friend as well. And so thank you so much for your intro and your hospitality and everyone else here at MCC. This is my second time visiting, and it's always been a real pleasure. So I thought that before I started talking, I would read a really brief, about 2.5 minute piece. It's part of a craft chapbook that I wrote a few years ago, and it's just a little piece called Genesis, which sort of talks a little bit about why I became a writer, the emotional impetus. I'm 9 years old in 1970, a Catholic school student wearing a plaid gray skirt and red sweater. Correction, I'm 9 years old, a Ichangtawane Dakota girl wearing stories you can't yet see or hear. I carry their weight on my skin, in my heart, pressed against my lungs. Unlike my fierce mother, I am a pacifist, wary of violence. Blank pieces of paper are my battleground. Our fourth grade teacher has assigned a history paper. We're to write about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where my people defeated General Custer and the 7th Cavalry in 1876. I write a paper using history books from my mother's extensive library, influenced by testimony she heard as a child from elderly warriors who survived the battle. I'm proud of my paper, each word spelled correctly, handwriting neat as the nuns who taught me cursive. It is magic to me how I can transfer stories from my heart to my pen, to the lined notebook paper, how I can send them into a world that might not be ready for them. I argue in my pages that Custer was a reckless egomaniac searching for gold and glory, and I back up my conclusions with evidence cited from history texts. My teacher hands back my paper, strangely empty of comments, though she has marked a big red A on the last page. She calls on us to read our papers aloud, whether they're skillful or messy, each of the students in her class, except for me. I raise my hand over and over, even though I'm shy. I'm the only Native student in this school. I'm the only person telling this particular story, different from my classmates' versions, which follow the accustomed line. A few of my friends even point to me to get the teacher's attention, but I am her blind spot. It's as if I don't exist. When class is dismissed, I carry my paper home with disappointment, despite the good grade, realizing that my stories are not allowed in some places, especially when they are true. So my mother and I are activists in very different ways. So I am going to get to the book, but I thought I would talk a little bit about how I became a writer, and it was probably for something that was inevitable because my parents met in the world of publishing, and they came from such different worlds. My mother was born and raised in Fort Yates, North Dakota, on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. She was born in 1925. And my dad was born in 1915. His dad was a physics professor at Cornell in Ithaca, New York, though he was raised in Albany, New York. And their backgrounds were so different, although they agreed politically on a lot of things. And my father wasn't interested in his background or his family history. So I was raised really thinking of myself mainly as a Native American. And because I was born and raised in Chicago, and my mother was the founder, one of the founders. There were a few of them. One of the founders of the American Indian Center in Chicago, which was the first center like that. Then there were others sprouting up in other cities, but that was the first one. That was like the template for other Indian centers. So my world in Chicago was a Native world, but it was multi-tribal. And I actually grew up very close to Ho-Chunk people and learned so many of their ways. So that was always how I thought of myself. But we were book lovers, and librarians noticed how reverently and gently I treated books, even when I was really little. So they allowed me to have my first library card when I was 2 years old. And I just was like, I felt like I'd won the lottery. Well, I didn't even know about the lottery then, but I was just like, oh, prized possession. So, yeah, I was all about language and books and just trying to will myself to read, before I'd been taught how to. Um, and also I was really shy. I still am shy and introverted, not when I'm in performance mode because I'm a theater person. But that's kind of like a different part of oneself. And so I could always express myself so much better with a pen in my hand than I could speaking orally. Though now I've had practice. I ain't smooth, but at least I've got some energy. So I'm like, all right, that should make up for some problems. Um, and because I was raised by such an activist mother, who and my parents were sharing with me their political views from the very beginning. We were a family. We were talking about all these things involved with the Indian rights and civil rights, and so I felt like our national anthem didn't really work for me. It wasn't in any way my story or the story of people that I knew and loved. So when I was 7, I wrote my own national anthem. So, that kind of little anger was in there, frustration with our country as much as I love it. Um, and being a drama queen, I loved poetry the most as a kid. And I loved those really long poems where everybody dies, or at least somebody dies, the tragedies. And as a kid, I would memorize those. And I such a weird little kid. Like, this is even before I was in school. I'm memorizing like the wreck of the Hesperus. And yeah, I could, my mother, when we'd have guests over, she'd say, okay. And she'd just tell me which one to do. And, I'd be performing these things. But it was the rhythm. The rhythm of language was so important to me. And it's still an important part of my process. To edit my work, I have to read it aloud and I'll record it so that I can listen, just listen, and not even have to focus on doing the reading while I'm in edit mode. Um, and so, yeah, I think they still have this up. I laugh now when I see, my degrees and what have you. And I'm like, oi, what was I thinking, to get this law degree? And it was really my mother's dream. And she just didn't have the opportunities that I did. But yeah, I'm an arts person. So I woke up eventually and returned to my passion and my calling. But okay, let me get to A Council of Dolls, which is why I'm here today. I actually had been working on a spooky novel, which I think it was in 2016. November of 2016 was the first time I was here visiting. And I gave a reading from that work in progress. The working title is really long: Harvard Indian Seance at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast. And I actually, with one of the fellowships that I was granted in 2017, I invited two of my writer friends, and I rented out the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast for the night, and it was intense. It was incredible. I've always been fascinated by that mystery. It's not she did it, Lizzie did it, but anyway. So I was reading it. The book is about these 5 Native American students at Harvard who are about to graduate. It's their senior year. The one of them who comes from money, they call her the Hollywood Indian. Anyway, because she's from LA. And she rents out the Lizzie Borden B&B for the night. And the Danae guy, who's like really brilliant when it comes to theoretical physics, but not always great about real life, he buys a little hatchet. He brings that and the Ouija board and craft beer. Because after a few years at Harvard, yeah, he's into the craft beer. Anyway, and it's like, what could possibly go wrong? And yeah, things get scary. So I was working on that novel when this one just came along. And I am what you would call an intuitive writer, in that, when I was first getting started, I liked the idea of maybe having a world that I could control. So, hey, if I'm a fiction writer, I get to decide what the world looks like and how people behave, how they treat each other. But and there are many writers who are able to do that. They just will think, I want to explore the idea of, or this particular dynamic between people, and they can make it work very well. It doesn't really work for me. And I learned early on that when I try to control my characters, when I decide things in advance, I want this to happen like this for them. Um, Sometimes it's not true for them. And my characters are so real for me. I feel like I have to figure out what their truth is and then follow that. So it's kind of like this groping, intuitive sort of thing where I'm really the servant, the assistant slash therapist slash, yeah, servant for my characters, not the puppeteer, puppet master, godlike figure going, "Wah, you will die, but you will be happy," and whatever. No, it doesn't work like that. But I'm sure some of you might have had this experience where you might be in a movie or reading a book and you're really loving it. And all of a sudden you hit a point where you just don't believe. You're like, that character would not do that. No, 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 no. And they've lost you. It's like you're just suddenly not as enthusiastic. And I feel like sometimes that's the hand of, it could be the author themselves, or it could be the money people behind them who are trying to influence them in a certain way, saying, no, 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 you can't make that choice. You have to change that. And so it's just, it feels inauthentic. And so I'm always aiming for authenticity. And oh, so this really came about in an odd way, this book. Back in fall of 2019, I needed some money. And there's this really terrific writing contest with the Missouri Review. And they have several different prizes they offer, but I was interested in the short fiction one. And the first prize is $5,000. And I'm like, the odds of my winning this are very slim, but why not try? I could definitely use that money. So I came up with this idea to write this short story. I ended up calling Naming Ceremony, that would be based on, what it was like growing up in the 60s in Chicago in my family. And I had certain plot points that were going to make it fiction, not autobiographical, but as I started writing it, things happened that I didn't expect. And this doll character suddenly was there showing up in a scene. Her name was Ethel, and she's Black. She's a tiny Thumbelina doll, which is the doll that one of the dolls I had as a little girl. And my tiny Thumbelina was also Black. And she's just this confidant, protector to this little girl who is narrating the story. And I thought, I don't know why a doll showed up, but okay, I trust this. It feels right. So I'm going to go with it. And so I finished the story. I sent it to the Missouri Review. It didn't win, but it was honorable mention. So I did make some money off of it, and they published it. And just getting to know the people there, the editors are so wonderful. So I'm really glad I did it. A year later, a dear friend of mine who's African-American and a writer as well, she reads that story and says, you could have a whole novel about Ethel and Black protectiveness. And that just started to open up my head to all kinds of possibilities. But when I decided, okay, I'm going to turn this little story into a novel, a whole book, I thought, I'm going to just stick with this one generation. And actually, before I continue to babble at you, let me read a little selection from the opening of this book. So this is Naming Ceremony, like the short story, but I expanded that short story for this part one of the book. And the character's name, well, her nickname, she has many names. Her nickname is Sissy, and she's growing up in the 1960s in Chicago. It's the spring of 1969 here in Chicago, and Mama says old Mayor Daley has his big fists wrapped around our necks. She says he doesn't care about brown people like us. If this city had a proper name, it would be Prejudiced, Illinois, Mama tells me while she braids my hair. I'm in the second grade at school, so I know what that word is all about. It's a mean word that says we can't eat in just any restaurant, even if my parents have enough money, and we can't move to just any neighborhood. If I got to name our city, I'd call it Sweetland, Because sometimes you have to be nice to people and places and dolls if you want them to be nice back, though it doesn't always work. I almost forget what my real name is. I have so many names, and I'm just skipping a little bit here. Mama says I have a Christian name, though we left the church in a huff a few months back when Mama shared in confession that she never felt the presence of anything sacred except at the Sundance we go to in North Dakota at summer solstice. The one Mama says is private because it's illegal. Dad said she was looking for trouble to say such things to old Father Weasel. His name isn't really Weasel. Mama gave him a look and he went quiet. I know what he was trying to say. Sometimes Mama's in a mood. She can't keep all to herself. She has to spread it around. She'll pick a fight with anyone, and it's no use tiptoeing, being sweet and well-behaved because she'll get you on that. Ask why everyone walks on eggshells near her like she's a crazy person. Then you're in the doghouse. She spread her mood on Father Weasel during her last confession. She even pushed up the sleeve of her nice, gray going to church dress to show the priest her scars from a flesh sacrifice, though he probably couldn't see much through the screen that separates him from us. And when Father Weasel told her the Sundance is devil's work, she said, if Jesus had made his own Sundance at the end, maybe we'd be in better shape. Father Weasel lost his head and told Mama she was beyond penance. I heard him since I was in a nearby pew saying 5 Hail Marys and 2 Our Fathers for confessing that I was sometimes angry with Mama in my thoughts. Mama grabbed my arm and dragged me out of church, and I never finished saying penance. So I guess I'm still carrying around that sin of anger inside me with nowhere to let it out. Mama reminds me that I have a Dakota name too, on top of the Christian one. She says Grandma gave it to me in a ceremony the year she lived with us. Oh, I wish she was still here with her soft hands and smiles and nice back rubs. And when I couldn't fall asleep right away at bedtime, I miss her stories about the day Sitting Bull was killed, how she was 3 years old, yet she remembered everything. But Grandma didn't like it in Chicago. She said all that noise hurt her head. So she went back to North Dakota, back to what she calls buffalo country, though I've never seen any buffalo there because this was in the 60s. Now you would see buffalo there. Only one I ever saw is stuffed and dead at the Field Museum. He doesn't look so happy. I should give him a name the next time I see him. As much as I love Grandma, I'm different from her when it comes to how I see our city. I like falling asleep to the noise of honking cars and sirens, grown-ups laughing as they walk down the street. Noise makes me feel safe, reminds me that there are people all around and I'm not alone. North Dakota scares me at night when the indoor lights go out and the stars switch on, a million more of them than I ever see in Chicago. The hills and towns where my relatives live, get quiet, so quiet. All you hear is your breath as you try to sleep. I start to imagine there's nothing outside but ghosts watching my every move. Even by day, North Dakota feels strange to me because there aren't as many people, and all the ones I've seen are either white or Indian. If they're white, they'll most likely stare at you as you walk into a store or a diner as if you're part bug. I begin to miss our neighborhood in Old Town Gardens where we have friends who are Black, white, Indian, or a family from Japan or the Philippines or Mexico. They have names I've never heard before that take practice before I can say them right. Mama says it's important to pronounce them correctly because we don't want to be like the ones who change people's names when they think they're too hard. I don't understand why Mama can be super polite to friends, only using the name they want, while she has all kinds of bad names for Dad. Some of them I can't say because they're not nice and I'd get punished. When she calls him those names, her eyes are so red, it looks like the whites are bleeding. She stomps around and throws things. One time she cracked the wall with a heavy pot. Another time she cracked my father's head and he had to go to the hospital. I helped her clean the mess. I almost threw up. When you're real scared, sometimes you can control that. So that's just a little bit of a taste of Sissy and um, oh, I didn't even read. I was going to read a little bit of where you actually uh, learn about Ethel. Sorry about that. Now, when Mama's eyes get bright red, I crawl under my bed, a trick I learned when I was small. Dad and Mama are watching the news, and I could hear it though I was playing with the doll I begged Dad to get me for Christmas. I wanted the black doll since she looks more like us, closer to Indian than the white dolls. She wriggles just the same as them when you pull the string on her back and wears the same clothes, but I can tell the difference. I call her Ethel, after one of Mama's friends I think is nice. I was brushing Ethel's hair the way she likes when my parents went super quiet. Dad put down the book he's always reading and leaned in as if he couldn't believe his ears. My dad's favorite anchorman, the one who puts his glasses on when things get serious, was talking about a guy named Speck, which is one of Mama's choice words when she's cleaning the floors, going to war against those specks. Every time they mentioned his name, I saw a black spot in my mind, a dark smudge on the wall there. He'd killed 8 student nurses right here in our city, but another survived because she made herself real small under the bed. Dad noticed I was listening and motioned to me, but Mama said, "She's only 4. She won't remember any of this." So they kept watching the news, and I kept brushing Ethel's slick hair, thinking all the time about smudges on the wall and hiding somewhere so death can't find you. And as a kid, I really I was cognizant of what happened when Richard Speck, because my parents were watching the news, and it really made an impression on me. And when we were staying somewhere else, I'd always scope out where might I be able to hide, if somebody just goes berserk like that and is killing people. And it disturbed me when hotels started doing this thing where you couldn't get under the bed. It was just kind of blocked off in this way because I'm like, where will I be able to hide? People, grown-ups think little kids aren't paying it. Oh, they're paying more attention than you might think. So when I'm figuring I'm going to write turn this into a novel, at some point as I was developing that chapter, that story to make it longer, I thought, the mother sometimes comes off as a villain in this piece because she is there's domestic abuse, but in this family it's not the husband or father, it's the wife and mother. And but the little girl, Sissy, just absolutely adores her, and she has a reason why. And so I thought, why don't I have another chapter, another section of the book where we get to see the mother as a child and we see where this comes from. Sure, in the Sissy chapter, the Indian boarding school experience she's gone through is brought up, but it's not gone into in depth. And so I wanted to have a chance to show her and who she is really at her core, this very loving person, and see what can happen when trauma works its way on a person and we don't all handle it spectacularly. Um, and so I thought, oh, what if she also has a doll? And there's that sort of symmetry there. Although the doll, I would have thought of maybe another baby doll, but the doll character that showed up was not one I was anticipating. It was the Shirley Temple doll. I mean, it fits the era because my mother, like this book hews to 3 generations of my own family in terms of our eras. So I grew up in the 1960s, like Sissy. My mother grew up she was born in 25, grew up in the 30s, like Lillian. And my grandmother was born in 1888, like Cora. So yeah, the Shirley Temple doll named May, after Mae West, because the doll just like Mae West. So yeah, she was hilarious. Each of these doll characters were so different, in temperament and in their background and how I worked with them as characters, how they showed up for me. And maybe because she was created to look like a Hollywood star. She had a little bit of that energy in her, because when in the final part of the book, I let the dolls tell parts of their stories from their own perspective. She was the one that just kept talking. As I'm typing, it's like I've got this little chirping going on in my ear, and this, and this, and oh, and this, and I was thinking this, and oh, and this, and I'm like, you can't take over the whole book, which she seemed to be threatening to do. And then at some point, I'm like, now there's another problematic parental figure in the Lillian section set in the 30s, and that's her father, Jack. And so I don't want him to be villainized. So that's why eventually I turned this into a multi-generational book with 3 generations in one family, because if I didn't want any of these parental figures to serve as villains in the book. I wanted them to be seen without judgment. And this was the only way I felt that I could do that, was to show them, yes, where they are difficult. They are difficult on their families and their loved ones. But then in the next section, you see them as a child and you see what they had to go through. So that hopefully by the end of the book, the reader, if you have to villainize anyone or anything, it will be more colonization and how it impacted my people and my family. And that will be the villain of the piece. So, okay, I want to read another section here. This from Lillian's point of view, or in Lillian's voice. And so she is Sissy's mother. And she's growing up in the 30s, as I mentioned. The Bureau of Indian Affairs doctor says I was born with a hole in the heart. It's the main thing I remember about myself and who I am. The first time I see a chicken heart, Ina making ready to cook it just for me when the other kids are running around outside and I'm stuck in a sawed-off beer keg with edges too high for me to climb. I beg her to let me hold it before it goes in the pan. Ina sighs, but gives it to me. The meat fills my palm. I bring it to my ear because my own heart makes noise when I do anything too much. But this one is silent, silent and perfect. There aren't any holes. I squeeze it and wish I could switch it for mine. I'm jealous of that heart in all its beauty, glad now that Ina is going to fry it up for me to eat. I will swallow what I can't have. And back in the day, why they're putting her in this sawed-off beer keg is because, they did have playpens existed at that point, but only wealthy people are going to have playpens. So they kind of created one for her to the best of their abilities. And this did happen to my mother in real life. She did have a hole in her heart. And so they were trying to keep her quiet for her first few years. And so she grew up inhaling well, I'll just let her tell you herself. Those first years, I spend more time with Ina than my sister and brothers. I grow up in that damn beer keg that smells like rotting fields. For years, I can't get away from the smell because even when I'm lifted out of the keg, I carry the stench on my clothes, skin, and hair. Alvina told me once that, okay, never mind, I'll skip that part. But yeah, my mom forever hated the smell of beer. And I don't know, maybe because, I'm her daughter, but I also had that, we just couldn't stand the smell of beer. So I want to read a little bit more in her voice, but I'm skipping. And there's mention made of a wobbly. And I don't know how many of you heard of the Wobblies, know about them, but they were the industrial workers of the world. They were socialists. And a lot of them found kinship with indigenous peoples, values-wise. They could see that we were all about sharing, that for us, the worst thing to be was like a hoarder. So, we would see millionaires or billionaires as people who need help. Not people that you're going to look up to and admire and ask for advice. It's like, no, they need help. Sorry, I can't help myself. My politics is always in there. I can read perfectly now. I taught myself from the one book we have in our cabin, left behind by an old wobbly who passed through town a few years ago and stayed with us for a week because he found my parents interesting. They are politics people who follow the complicated disputes of leaders on our reservation and even those in Bismarck, North Dakota and Washington, D.C. I think he left that book behind as payment because we shared our food with him, even though that meant no one had a full stomach. He had kind eyes in a cold color, silver ice. He showed me the book one night, brought it over to my beer keg, and propped it on the edge so I could see the pictures. This is a book on child labor, he said, pointing to photographs of scrubby-looking white children with dirty faces and no smiles. They are treated inhumanely by greedy bosses. I wasn't interested in the bosses, but after the wobbly left, I liked to bring his book into the beer keg with me so I could visit with those children who made me cry. That's how I thought of it, that we were friends now, with me peeking in the book's windows to wave at them. Some days I swear they waved back. When I'd memorized each face and had made up a name for every kid, they started talking to me in my head. They helped me pick out the words beneath their pictures, then words at the top of the page. By the time I was 4, I could read the whole thing, and people came to our cabin to test me, their mouths hanging open as I read and read about white children who were maybe as poor as us, but looked more miserable. And I just want to give you a little bit of a taste of Jack, who is the sort of difficult parent in this section. Ina works a small shuttle in her hand to make magic. I like to watch her take something as plain as string and turn it into a lacy giant snowflake that drapes over her arm as it grows. She says this is tatting, which she learned how to do at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in faraway Pennsylvania. She sings Carlisle songs as she tats, tunes she said were performed by their marching band. She hums Dakota songs while she peels potatoes and cooks. She can be many people, just not at the same time. And she changes again whenever he is home. When he is in a good mood, she laughs and lets him pull her into a stiff-legged dance. When he is angry, smelling of hooch, she's so quiet you can barely see her. Ina melts into the walls. I don't call our father Ate or any English versions of the word. I call him or Jack. Even when he's nice to me, I am always keeping one eye on him because you need to watch what he's thinking. Today, when he comes home from no work with no coins and only a half stink of hooch, he waves me over from my perch on the big bed I share with my sisters and little brothers. I've been reading the child labor book for the 1 millionth time. I tuck it under the blanket to keep those kids warm. I'm not going to steal your book, he says. He isn't frowning, so I take my time crossing the room. I know. What's in your noggin today? He pats me on the head, and even though he means well, his hand is heavy, which makes my knees buckle. Ina is here and not here. Me and Blanche made a graveyard, I tell him. Blanche and I. He pats me harder. Blanche and I. English is his second language, or maybe his fourth, because he spoke all 3 dialects of our language before he ever went to school. But he hates English so much, he's careful with it. He wants us to be careful too. Go on. Blanche and I made a graveyard for the birds. With him, it's best to say as little as possible because you never know what word will come at him like a punch and make him angry. So I don't tell him how we buried Julius, our pet magpie that died in the night, Ina giving us a piece of fabric to wrap him up with all the odds and ends of treasures he stole that aren't worth anything to anybody else. I also keep quiet about the second burial we performed once our bird was safely in the ground and properly mourned, with testaments to his good character, thieving aside. Blanche said we should bury Jack. to keep Ina from falling pregnant every year and suffering miscarriages, to keep her from turning invisible. Each time he walked through the door, I looked around to make sure no one overheard my sister's mischief. Blanche brought a bucket of water from the well and poured it on the ground. I watched as she worked the mud in her hands, molding it into a man the size of a doll. I did this part, so you dig, she ordered. I was too surprised and nervous to argue with her. I grabbed Ina's garden spade and chipped at the dirt until I'd made a pit large enough to hold the mud father. Blanche used the spade to scoop him up and then paused in her work as if shocked by how little he weighed, how much she'd reduced him to child size with her mud magic. She let him slide into the hole, not seeming to care that he fell to pieces, the head smashed by the rest of him. She covered him up with a small hill of earth and patted down the grave. Blanche crossed her arms, clutching her shoulders, and spoke as solemnly as the local priest. Here lies our Father who art not in heaven, and piss be his name. We won't cry over you. You'll never be missed. You can drink with the devil, and we don't care if he roasts your liver. My legs weren't shaking until she started saying we. She included me in her angry medicine, and it made me feel unsafe, like we were the lone trees for miles exposed on Proposal Hill as lightning slashed the sky, headed straight for us. Okay, I'm going to skip to this one last little piece here about Jack. It's late, so these two girls, well, the whole family, all the children are going to boarding school, Indian boarding schools, as my mother and all her siblings did. And so I write about it in depth because there are many families where those who went to these Indian boarding schools in Canada, they were called the Indian residential schools. People were so traumatized, they just couldn't talk about it. And so there were just all these secrets. But my mother was a storyteller. She was always sharing. So I was very lucky. So I learned a lot about her experience in these schools and also my grandparents' experiences because they both went to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. It's late summer and we all feel the shadow of a new school year creep closer. Ina puts us to work in her garden on a hot morning with a furnace wind. The dry soil scrapes at our faces like sandpaper and we sweat through our overalls. Blanche and I are at war with potato bugs. We're not squeamish, though we do get sick of the flies treating our cabin like it's theirs. But potato bugs are vile. Even Ina, who taught us to honor all beings, who made us return beans we stole from a field mouse's hidden catch, who insists we should never kill Unthomi or ruin her webs. Even she is no fan of the six-legged monster with a demon face. We have to inspect each plant near the root and carefully remove the bugs so its jaws don't chomp our fingers. To kill them, we snap off their heads and toss them in a jar of kerosene. We try to tempt Fairbanks with fresh corpses, since he has a taste for beetles. But he hops away from us like we're trying to poison him, shrieking, "Bad, bad." In outrage, he's a fussier fellow than our last pet magpie. We shouldn't have named him after a movie star. Goodbye, Sister Frances. Goodbye, Sister Bernard. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Blanche is mumbling at the doomed bugs until I wonder if she has sunstroke. What are you talking about? She glares at me like I'm the one responsible for this chore. I'm pretending that it's not just potato bugs I'm massacring. Oh. Next thing I know, I'm copying Blanche. Goodbye, Sister Nora. Goodbye, Sister Gertrude. It is very satisfying to eliminate the nuns from our garden as if we're actually removing them from their positions as teachers and overseers at our boarding school, so we'll never have to see them again. There's only one we consider decent. We kill Sister Frances over and over, but Sister Anne escapes death. And maybe this game gets us in trouble with the mission school god. Maybe he's just as hot as we are, so his sense of humor has melted, because pretty soon Jack is staggering toward us, shouting in a mix of languages all jumbled by hooch. He's carrying his ancient shotgun, which is as much a danger to him as any target. Blanche grabs my wrist as if to steady me. We rise together slowly until our knees lock tight to help make us feel brave. Jack settles on raving in English, shouts that if we don't clear out, he'll shoot us into the next world. He screams that he's not going back to Carlisle. No one can take him back to Pennsylvania. I'm not leaving my ma. I'm not leaving my sister. They need me. He's 10 feet away now and swaying. The shotgun wavers between Blanche and me. You can't take me away. I'll kill you first. He shouts and shouts, the words scraping his voice raw. How he's not a boy, he's a man. He starts blubbering and almost drops the gun as he swipes his eyes with one arm. Must have been a bad patch, my sister whispers. There have been times where Jack got his hands on hooch that is so dangerous it fries his brain, messes with his vision so he can't properly see. Hooch has blinded Jack, turned his girls into reservation agents or other officials who want to drag him across the country to kill the Indian part of him and turn him into a white man. As a kid, he ran away from Indian boarding school so many times he was declared a delinquent and locked up in an adult jail for a whole year. I hear movement behind me. See Alvina dart into a run just outside Jack's limited field of vision. She's no doubt headed for Little Soldier's place to get help. He's our grandpa Indian way. He was a young fighter in the battle that wiped out Custer and his men, though he never brags about war exploits or victories. If anyone can bring Jack out of his monster drunk, it's this sweet old man who refuses to sit in a chair or lie down on a bed. He carries a large square of canvas to spread on the ground when he wants to sit or nap, and his back is so straight. Blanche told me a story about how his spine isn't human bone, but the sapling trunk of a cottonwood tree. I knew she made that up, but decided to believe it anyway because Grandpa Little Soldier deserves to be part tree. I try not to stare at Jack, though I want to keep an eye on the gun. My sick heart feels kicked up like a herd of wild horses. I keep having to swallow. Fear is greasy in my mouth. I'm sliding away from my body because it's too uncomfortable to stay inside it. Maybe Jack already killed me and I'm a ghost looking back at myself and Blanche. The sun is behind me now, boring its heat through my skull. I can't be dead or I wouldn't feel anything. Jack is gone now and I'm standing where he is and the gun is heavy in my hands. I'm so confused. Why can't I just set the weapon down? Because Blanche is still holding my wrist like she's handcuffed to me. I slide back into my body just in time to hear Grandpa Little Soldier ride up on his horse. Before I learn how it's all going to turn out, find out if Jack murders us in the yard, my face rushes at the ground in a dead faint. So that is some of the things that Lillian was going through as a kid at home, but also you see what's going on in the Indian boarding school. So I have about 15 minutes before opening things up for questions. So let me just check what I have left off. Oh, yes. One of the questions I'm often asked about this book is, why did doll characters show up? Why are there these three different doll characters? There's Ethel, who I talked about before, the tiny Thumbelina. That's a real doll they sold in the late 60s, maybe early 70s, made by the Ideal Company, though I'm not doing an ad for them. And then the Shirley Temple doll, May. And then there's a third doll character named Winona, which is a Dakota name, and she's a traditional Dakota doll. She's made of deer skin, and originally she was made with porcupine quills, creating the features on her face because she's a really old doll. But as she was handed down over the years, she was sort of redesigned or refreshed, where some mother picked out the porcupine quills and then beaded her features on her face. But she has seen a lot. One of the girls she was a confidant and protector to is at the, well, if you look it up online, it's called the Battle of Whitestone Hill. In my family, it's the massacre of Whitestone Hill, where our people were, I mean, essentially it was attempted genocide. Well, that's a long story. Just anyway, it's just one of those horrific episodes in American history. And so, we're raised with this story and this history, knowing about it. And just this peaceful village of my ancestors. My great great grandfather was Chief Matonupa, Chief Two Bear, and they weren't involved in any war with the United States. We're in a territory where we're still somewhat removed from what was happening in other areas, and we had just had a successful buffalo hunt, and I forget how many hundreds of thousands of pounds of buffalo meat was being cured that would get them through the winter. And but these northern generals, Sully and Sibley, just attacked and were killing as many people as they possibly could. And then they burned all of the teepee lodges and the food and anything that was left behind, because they wanted to make sure that survivors who crawled away in the night, injured and that they wouldn't have anything. They would starve. They would then starve them out. And yeah, okay, I won't go into another political. I see political. I'm just somebody who's just political rant after political rant. Whew, but yeah, I'll just say history isn't history. At least the way I see it, and it comes around again for us to learn at long last. At least that's my perspective. So, but anyway, that's a little bit of my family's experience. And so here's this doll, Winona, who sees her beloved girl and her beloved girl's entire family just massacred before her eyes. And then when this conflagration is set of fire, everything burning, this doll she can only lie there, and she's watching it, and she's wishing she would burn too. And her hair kind of goes up, but she survives. And another thing that happened in at this horrific massacre scene is that people were trying to rescue their babies and children. So dogs, we had our beloved dogs who could pull, we had horses that could pull larger travois, but we also had dogs that could pull smaller ones. Like some of the household supplies would be strapped to them, and they would carry them when we were breaking down one village and going to put it up somewhere else. And so they were strapping their babies and children to the travois the dogs were hauling. And so in the book, Winona is rescued by a dog. She doesn't know whether the dog thinks she is another child. He just very gently, picks her up in his jaws, or whether he understands that this is a beloved toy, and, he understands toys and children and wanting to them to have whatever they need. And so she is, unfortunately for her, rescued. And so these three dolls they just showed up in my imagination, not dolls I would have expected, and I had to work with them so differently. As I mentioned a little earlier, with Winona, she was the most traumatized of the dolls. She has seen so much over many decades, and so it's like I had to coax her to get more of her history, like who made her, what's the story behind her having been made. It's almost like sometimes it feels to me as if some of my characters take a while before they trust me. I know this sounds a little woo-woo, but this is honestly how I work. They're very real to me. And it's like they want to make sure I'm not taking advantage of them, or I'm not using them, or that I actually will be respectful and will wait till I know what was true for them, what would be true for them and authentic for them. And then it's like, then they open, and then I'm like, yes, I can always feel it when I'm getting the true story. But I guess part of me wasn't too surprised that dolls would become such important characters. And this is not a book for children, even though it's narrated. 3 of the 4 parts are narrated by children. The 4th part is Sissy grown up because, well, I'll get to that later. Why in the last few minutes. So I wasn't too surprised dolls showed up. Especially because the way I was raised, and this isn't just our family. I know there are a lot of indigenous people who believe this, that everything has spirit, that there's no such thing as inanimate objects. And sometimes it's in some of our languages. There's no inanimacy in the language, because everything is animate. Everything has spirit, whether it's a table, whether it's a stone, what it has a spirit. It was made for a purpose, and it has agency. And so when I was a kid, this was one of the wonderful things about my mother, is her imagination, and she could just spin a story out of anything. If she were sitting here, she would start, and if I was this little kid, she'd start take me looking at these things, and she'd say, "Oh, some of them are jealous. Some of them think that they have prettier illustrations, or some of them are friends, but they're separated, so they have to pass along stories from one to the other and hope that they're truth tellers along the way, and it's not getting made up and mixed up as it goes from this one over here." She would just see stories everywhere. So that's how and oh my God, when we had to, we were always buying these used Fords. They were on their last legs for our car, and then putting a lot more miles on them, going to powwows or going to different, up activist um, places where, there was a protest movement here, a protest movement there. And so when we had to, hand them in and get another one because they were just really dead now, mom and I would be weeping over the car and just apologizing and just thanking it for all it had done and the good memories. And, so it wasn't the stretch for these dolls to have their own backstories and their own ideas on things. And it was fun for me just seeing how different they were and how they worked so differently. And there was one really unexpected character that shows up in the book, though, and that's in part 4, where Sissy has grown up and she's contending with all of this family trauma from generations. I mean, she's also been gifted so much rich cultural heritage and spiritual heritage. And so I don't mean to say, oh, it's all bad. It's all not, by any means. But if you've got trauma, and it can be a lot. And she has a lot of mental health issues she's wrestling with. And so as I was writing early on her section, all of a sudden a bird character flew into the scene as I'm typing. And I'm like, who is this? And he grabs one of the dolls by the hair, and so it turns out he's Prince. I live in the Twin Cities, and so Prince really figure. We're so proud of the purple one. And cockatoos, I love cockatoos, and he's a cockatoo. And I watch the videos on YouTube of cockatoos, sometimes how they really get down. They're dancing. They're really incredible. Some of them. So that's my cockatoo character, Prince. He's a dancer. So I was like, why is he in this section of the book? And I realized he was always making me laugh. And so a lot of this, it is fiction, but there are also episodes that do come from my family's history. And a lot of this experience is very familiar to me. And so that can be very heavy to be working with it as a writer, to be immersed in it. And so I thought, oh, he's my fictional emotional support bird. Who just showed up, sorry, just checking the time. Okay. So let me I've got 5 minutes here. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the whole point of this book, which I wasn't sure of until I was well into the creation of it. Realizing that it was all about healing, especially healing intergenerational trauma that a lot of people are writing about and talking about these days. And I think for some of us who come from families where, or just knowing our ancestors went through so much more than we can even imagine. They had to be such survivors. We can feel guilty about our little pains and our little issues and what have you. Like, what right do I have to complain about anything or to need help for anything? And so it took me a very long time to in any way try to get help for my own major depression. Sometimes yeah, it just kept me from being out there living in the world for great lengths of time, and PTSD and things like that. And the more I thought about it, trying to give myself permission to get help, was, back in my mother's day and my grandmother's day, as hard as they had it, they didn't have the suicides that we have now. Nothing like that. Nothing like that, right? Um, Even as devastated as they were by colonization, by all the forces of colonization, there was still enough of the kinship networks intact, like Grandpa Little Soldier, who he's the only character in here who is, I didn't change the name because I wanted to honor him and how much he meant to our family, even though he wasn't a blood relation. And so, we had so much and of our cultural, spiritual, um, and societal networks in place. I think that was a good reason why survivors sort of did a better job of surviving in some ways. And then the next generation is contending with more loss. Now, we're not all about loss. It's amazing all of the language programs to bring our languages back, to bring our there's a lot that's going on that's so positive. I don't have time to go into all of that. But you start to see the next generation's doing a little bit worse, maybe not materially, but internally. And then you get to the next generation and all these suicides. And it's like, yeah, each generation is hauling more and more and more of those difficulties that their ancestors and previous generations went through. So yes, by all means, give yourself permission to seek whatever help. Once I was ready for traditional therapy, I couldn't afford it. So mine came in untraditional ways. And I have to say, some Buddhist, even though I'm not Buddhist authors helped me tremendously, because I inherited a really ugly inner script. I think my mother picked hers up in these Indian boarding schools where these kids were constantly being put down and shamed. And she told me so many stories about the things that they would say to her, even though she was such a brilliant kid, probably because she was such a brilliant kid. And so I inherited that same hateful script about myself. It's so damaging. It would heap acid on any little mistake or foible that I made. And if I did something good, it would say, well, you've had every opportunity in the world. It'd be really ridiculous if you didn't. It was always just bringing me down. But these Buddhist authors taught me you could retrain that mind. You could remake that script. You just had to gently correct it. So I would spend my day all day as my chatty brain is being mean and flinging abuse. No, correction. It took me years. But one day in 2019, I made a mistake. It wasn't a big mistake, but in the past, I would have just said awful things. And the inner voice says, that's okay. It's not a big deal. And I love you anyway. Who said that? I said that. Oh my God. And I became my own best friend and best ally, and life changed completely. So really, my projects come to me. I don't seem to be able to go after them. It's like they come to me. I don't always understand why. Now I understand why as I go around talking with people, hearing from readers, and how much this book has been helping some people to understand better, earlier generations in their family, to understand what they've been going through, and to begin these conversations within families, things that were taboo to talk about, to really ultimately for healing purposes. And so before I open it up for questions, this is so short, it'll take a minute. I just want to read the last paragraphs of the book, which doesn't give anything away plot-wise, but I allowed the dolls to have the last say in this book. So this is these three dolls speaking. We've learned that healing the present doesn't only clear waters flowing into the future. Recovery also flows backward and alleviates the suffering of ancestors, so they can set down their tears and dark memories, their guilt and shame, their vengeance. And because time is our relative, a flexible being that moves through every thought and memory, branching into a million rivers of possibility. Healing even one of its streams will eventually heal the world. Wrecked children inherit the power of the destroyed, a formidable energy. They create the ferocious allies they need either to survive or let go and embrace destruction. Mended children carry stronger medicine. Their magic unites the flow of time with love, our oldest waters. And so they bring us home. And I have to say that as I was typing some of these sections, I would be doing this and I was like, wait, why? What's going on? It's like, oh, you're crying. I wasn't aware that I was crying until it was starting to get in the way physically, dropping onto the laptop. And there were so many moments where I felt, even though I'm typing alone in my room, I did not feel alone. I just felt like a crowd was around me, behind me. I really felt the presence of ancestors so strongly. So I'm glad that they tapped me and said this, and the timing would later give me chills. I finished writing the first draft, which is the draft I sent out in seek of a literary agent, on May 26, 2021. Less than a week after that, news broke of a discovery of a gravesite of Indigenous children who had gone to this Indian residential school in Canada, in Kamloops, Canada. And then all of a sudden in the news, it seemed like every other day almost, certainly every week for a while, these kinds of graves were being discovered near the vicinity of former Indian boarding schools, both in Canada and here in the United States. And so, I was like, oh, this is why I was meant to write this now. Not that there aren't other books about the Indian boarding school experience, but very few are written by Indigenous peoples. Very, very, very few. There are two scholars who have written about it, and I list them in the back of the book. And Tommy Orange, who's such a brilliant Native writer, Cheyenne. He has a new book out now called Wandering Stars, where he also covers a little bit of that experience. Such a powerful, powerful book. So, we're just now beginning to come forward with our stories because it was such a trauma. There are people who didn't want to talk about it. Oh, and I did one last thing. I wanted to give a shout out. It has a long name, so I always have to write it down. I'm a member of this group, and they're doing wonderful work around in this country, called the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And it was founded in 2012. They're dedicated to healing Native communities impacted by boarding school experiences. And they do this in a number of ways. They're making records available to us about our ancestors. At some of these schools, they're trying to get all of this digitized so that we can know more about what they were going through, what their health was like. You could see sometimes how their health deteriorated shortly after getting to these schools. For those who went through the experience and are still alive, the chance to get them what help they need, to give them platforms to talk about their experiences, and on and on. So they do a lot of wonderful work. So I just wanted to honor them. So if I haven't totally freaked everyone out, I can be a lot with my little rants. Tried to behave. I would be happy to take any questions folks might have, both here and via Zoom. And someone's going to help me apparently with the Zoom.
One individual said, love your book, but when will be able to your Harvard?
Thank you for asking about that. And yes, that's the one that I read from, excerpts from when I was here in 2016. And I'm back on that one now. And I've promised my agent, though she never pressures me ever, that I'm going to hand it in September 1st. I learned a lot writing this book, and I realized I was really overcomplicating the structure of the Harvard Indian Sands one. So yeah, that one is more fun for me, even though there are some really awful things that happen. But but I love the 5 main characters who are all Native American students at Harvard. They're all from different tribal nations. They're class of 2013, and they spend the night together for their last hurrah together at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast, which, as I was telling people before we started, I got a chance to stay there with a couple of friends overnight, and we rented out the place, and we each had pretty intense experiences. And yeah.
Any other questions? Understanding that health issues, does that help shape some of the trauma of the characters?
Do you mean their mental health, emotional health?
They just said health issues,
Health.
so I would guess it would encompass all of it.
Yes. I mean, I think that's so much the purpose of this, is to acknowledge, and that's why I earlier on when I was talking about why I decided to have more than one generation, because I didn't want to have any of these parental figures villainized, seen as, oh, that's just a bad parent. Oh, no, 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 no. It's so much more complicated than that. And they can be wonderful. Even, there are times where there's scenes, where he can just be amazing. He can be an ally. It's just, when someone is unhealthy, you never know what to expect. So you grow up, being very careful, because you're like, today could be a good day, or this hour could be a good hour, and then the next hour could be a really scary hour and everyone's going to die. You grow up kind of clenched, but it's not because you're dealing with someone awful. It's because you're dealing with someone wounded. Not to let them off the hook for doing terrible things, but yeah, I really tried to bring compassion to dealing with each and every one of these characters except one. And this, I don't feel bad about it. I should, but I don't. Sister Frances, and she's just terrible. And she's based on a real Sister Frances that I knew when I went to Catholic school, and I'll just not go any farther than that. So yeah, I don't know what was in her history or whatever, and I know it's unfair, but I just couldn't seem to have a lot of compassion for her because she was so cruel, needlessly cruel to small children.
Is there an audiobook? And if so, are you the one who narrates it?
No, I'm not. I narrated my first one and vowed I would never do that again. It was a crazy experience. But I'm so proud. This feels like such a Dakota book. So I'm Dakota, and I've written the book. The cover is Dakota, beadwork artist Holly Young. She's the one that created the artwork that's used on the cover. And I was given a choice by my editor of several Native American actresses to see who I'd like to tap to do the audible version. And one of them is Dakota, Isabella LeBlanc, who was just in this season's, what is it called? True Detective, the one with Jodie Foster on HBO. So she is Jodie Foster's daughter in that. I'm so proud of her, and she lives in the Twin Cities, so I've gotten to meet her. So she does the reading for the novel.
Anybody have any questions here? Okay. Do you think passing down the traditions of your cultures would help reduce the mental health and suicide issues?
And these are all wonderful questions. Thank you for your questions. And that's a terrific question. And yes, the short is yes. And we've seen that. It's not just me. We've seen this for a while now with communities where a family just was like, we have to turn this around. And so they just, maybe one family just started, they're like, okay, we're not drinking. This is going to be a safe family for kids who need somewhere to go to if there's mayhem going on in their family. They just need somebody to listen to them. And okay, we're going to start doing ceremony. If somebody wants to do ceremony here with us, that's great. It's open policy. We're not pushing this on anybody. And then gradually you've got a few families involved. And there's some communities where it's taken over, a lot of people, and you could just see everything turning around for the better. And I'm not someone who believes that there's ever been some kind of perfect human experience on earth and a group of people who are just perfect, but there are healthier societies, there are healthier networks that we can learn from. And I do think that cultures that have these extensive kinship networks where it's understood what your duties are, you don't have children growing up in a situation where they just have, one or two parents and everything's happening behind closed doors. Oh, no, 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 no. The way the Lakota society was, you've got all these aunts and all these uncles. You've always got, and everything's playing out very much in the open. You can't have the kind of domestic abuse and child abuse that we see now because there are no secrets that people are able to keep in that kind of really very interwoven kinship network of responsibility. And so, that's really vital to recovery for an individual, for a family, and for a community. Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this question is specifically for you or one of your characters. Do you think seeing the white children suffering impacted her view of society?
Yes, and thank you. That was referring to the section I read from Lillian's point of view, which would have been my mother's generation, where she really cares about these little kids that she sees who are, victims of child labor, and she knows that she and her family, they're poor too. I mean, everyone's hungry all the time. This is the Depression. It's a hard time for a lot of the country, but it was already a hard time for Dakota people on these reservations where everything has changed for them so quickly. But yeah, there's that compassion, seeing, these other people might even have it harder sometimes in other ways. And just thinking about all of the things, the protectors that she has, like a grandpa little soldier. And I really do want to underscore, I was raised not only with the dark stories, the difficult stories, but wonderful stories too, like our professional storytellers, people in the community who, especially ones that told good ghost stories. Oh, everyone wanted them to come and stay for a while because, they didn't have television and people were really poor. So even though radios were available, few people my mother knew had radio when they were growing up. And so these storytellers would come and stay with a family, maybe for a few nights. And so every evening they're listening and as they're telling all of these stories, and just so many experiences in her life that were really wonderful, and the ways that she was taught to honor other beings. It's not just humans that are the most important. So, yeah.
Okay, and there is a comment, love your poetry, with multiple exclamation points.
Oh.
I think you've answered some of these just in your presentation. How difficult is it to portray trauma and anxiety through your characters?
And again, thank you for these questions. That's another great question. Sadly, it was actually cathartic for me because I've grown up with mental health issues, with depression and anxiety and PTSD. Thankfully, the depression is so much better. But yeah, I'm still as folks here who I've met can attest to, I can still be a little bit anxious, and I still have PTSD. I work on that. So for me, writing about something so familiar to me, and not feeling guilty about it, because I wasn't writing about me. I was placing this experience, what it feels like, in someone else's shoes. It was so cathartic. It really helped me tremendously. And I'm trying to destigmatize mental health problems. We wouldn't, if someone had pneumonia, which I've had several times in my life, you wouldn't be ashamed to say you had pneumonia. And people wouldn't be like, oh, they would just go, oh, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. But it wouldn't be like, oh, wow. Right. And so I feel like there are still people who are, you don't always want to share when they have mental health issues. And I was so inspired by students of mine when I was teaching at the University of Minnesota. And they started a club a few years back that was for students who have had mental health diagnoses. And they're trying to destigmatize that and just be open. I'm bipolar, or I'm this, I'm that. And we're just like everybody, this is just the thing that we have to manage. And it shouldn't be a big deal, and it shouldn't be embarrassing, and we shouldn't have to keep it hidden from people. And so taking a page from their book, I thought, oh, I'm going to be more open and honest about this. And, if people want to judge, that's okay. But I mean, it's not okay, but that's their problem, not mine. So,
And I'm just wondering, have any of your books ever been banned?
I think to be banned, you have to be like a major bestseller. Although The Grass Dancer, it wasn't a New York Times bestseller, but it was on various bestseller lists. But that was also in an era where, there wasn't the frenzy around banning that we're seeing now. I have to say that the books that are banned, they actually become even better sellers. So it's like, I think the policy is horrific, but I'm happy for the authors,
Yes.
It's like, yeah.
Yes, my family all goes out and buy them, including, Where's Waldo books.
Oh, I know. Some of it you're like,
Thanks.
what? Clearly, whoever's banning this
So-
book has never read it. It was some of them. Well, I
I
think
think our time
our
is done.
time. Thank you
Thank you
so much
so
for all
much.
those who were patient enough to wait, and as we worked through the tech issues, and thank you for being kind and for showing up with such great questions. And thank you to my hosts who've been wonderful.
And thank you for sharing your book with us and your thoughts, answering our questions. We appreciate your time. This has been really lovely.
Thank you.